from the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
Today we mark a truly grim, heartbreaking milestone. 500,071 dead. That's more Americans who have died in 1 year in this pandemic than in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined.
Scenes from the Washington National Cathedral, where on February 22nd, the bell tolled once for every 1,000 lives claimed by COVID-19, which means it tolled 500 times. Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, 500,000. Joining us via Zoom to talk more about it is Andrew Hogan. Andrew is an associate professor of history and medical humanities. He is also the director of the Science and Medicine in Society program at Creighton University. Welcome.
Thank you, Kathy.
I want to start by asking you for your thoughts as you watched and listened to that opening clip.
Well, they were really important words from President Biden. And the tolling of bells is really a meaningful gesture and an important way of quantifying what has been a horrible tragedy for this country, which really is of unimaginable scale from the perspective of a year ago, as we knew that this was coming. But at the same time, numbers have their limits because they don't capture the individual experiences, which have been widely variable across our population. It's a huge number of deaths, and it's also a relatively small percentage of our population, which has been unequally affected by this tragedy. Many people know those who have been affected, and many others don't know people who are directly affected. So I'd say the quantitative comparisons are one way of measuring an impact, but are still lacking in doing justice to the true tragedy of COVID for so many people and families.
Yeah. To help us kind of understand where we are today, let's go back to where we were. Take us back to the beginning, Andrew, and talk about, kind of what happened there and what the country's initial reaction was.
Well, we first heard about COVID around the new year. We didn't necessarily have a name for it yet or a sense of what was going on, but we knew that there was a new infectious disease taking place in China. We learned eventually about its spread in Wuhan and other places. And very quickly, we now know it came to the United States. We certainly saw it coming, and one of the first major moves by the US government was to close off travel from China in late January. It wasn't a complete shutdown because US citizens were still able to travel, but it certainly made a difference. And then in February, we had some of our first spread of cases, community spread, and deaths. By March, our country really began to shut down in ways that were shocking for so many people. And then in April, we saw the massive death toll in places like New York City and New Jersey from this disease. So it was definitely a striking turn of events. Another 6 weeks or so passed before the Trump administration chose to cut off travel from Europe. And we now know that a lot of the infections in New York City and New Jersey and other places across the country were initially seeded by European travelers as opposed to Chinese travelers, or travelers coming from China, I should say. And I think historically, public health has been rather hesitant to take these sorts of draconian steps of shutting down travel from places, thinking that perhaps the harms of the reactions overrule some of the benefits. But in retrospect, it seems like shutting down travel from China when President Trump did, and shutting down travel from Europe perhaps quite a bit earlier might have made a huge difference in this country.
Well, let's talk about kind of how things did shake out. There seemed to be so many chances to hold this virus somewhat at bay, and yet the United States didn't seem to heed the warnings, travel maybe being one of them. How would you respond to that?
Well, I just think it was such a shocking set of events that we really didn't have experience with at this level in basically anybody's lifetime. And so there's some level at which it isn't too surprising that we were somewhat slow to react in some of the ways that we did. We've had past pandemics. We had one during the Obama administration of H1N1 that didn't end up being terribly deadly here in the United States. And so I think people perhaps initially thought that this would be a replay of that. And over time, we learned more and learned that it wasn't going to be that way. Initially, this was a very fluid situation, and we only knew so much about the way in which this disease was communicated. Initially, we talked a lot about surfaces or presumed that it was more large droplets. And over time, we learned that it could move through the air within rooms in quite striking and infectious ways. And so we reacted slowly, and I think in many cases too slowly, to some of this information as it was coming out.
This might be a good time in the interview, Andrew, to ask you to share a little bit about your background and what you saw, as all of this was coming down, given your areas of expertise.
Yeah, my area of expertise is the history of science and medicine. And in particular, I do look at the post-World War II period. And so there are some parallels to this that immediately sort of strike a historian of post-war America, including the polio outbreaks of the 1940s and 50s and the HIV/AIDS outbreak of the 1980s and 90s. And those were vastly different cases. In the polio case, we saw a lot of fear and uncertainty because of the ways that polio affected, especially children, though it affected adults as well. In HIV/AIDS, we certainly saw a lot of resistance or indifference to doing much about the outbreak for quite a long time, in large part because of the stigma associated with it, because of its association with the gay population in America. When we look at the history of pandemics, it's important to understand the ways in which society reacts to them and the way in which we ascribe importance or significance to them. And that varies over time and has a lot to do with factors like the death toll, but also our sense of individual risk and culpability in spreading this disease.
Yeah, which is actually a pretty good segue into a graphic that we want to put up for folks. U.S. known to lead things, unfortunately not the thing we would want to lead. In fact, when we put this up, the United States has a grim lead over other countries. So walk us through this. What is this saying other than what I've already said, Andrew? Give us some time to kind of process here.
Well, what this graph shows is change over time, of course, over the course of the pandemic. And so the US was low in March, but really took off in April and May, as did some of these other countries. Some countries took off earlier, like Italy and Iran. Some took off later, like Mexico and India. it's important to note that these are raw numbers. And so the United States, 500,000 deaths is a huge and horrible number, which I don't think we could have ever imagined seeing this time last year. And other countries also have these very high numbers. The United States is certainly well above them. We have to be careful with a graph like this to bear in mind that these are raw numbers as opposed to the percentages per million of population. And so the United States is a larger country than many of these. India is certainly bigger. So that tells us something, but it is a larger number that has a larger population by quite a bit than some of these other countries. In fact, if we look at this in terms of deaths per million people, the United Kingdom is a little bit above the United States at this point. If we put the European Union on this chart, so not a country, but a collective of countries, we would see that they would have pretty similar numbers to the United States, right around 500 or 550,000 deaths at this point. The European Union has about 100 million more people than the United States does. And so as a percentage of the population, it would be lower, but it certainly, as this chart reflects, would be just as strikingly high, which tells us something about the similarities in impact between Europe and the United States.
Okay. I guess one thing we don't see there, which countries, and you've probably looked pretty closely at this, which country or countries did this right, maybe have fewer regrets than some of the rest of us, right? Who did it right and why?
Well, I have to say at first that, this was a very fluid situation. And so we could point at different mistakes and different right moves by countries. We could fault China for initially having a lack of transparency about the outbreak of this virus and how extensive it was and how it was spreading in December and January, and say that perhaps it wouldn't have spread the way it did if there had been more oversight there. We can certainly fault the United States for not pushing masks earlier. That there was a lot of mixed information, a key moment in February and March in terms of whether people should be wearing masks, whether they should be acquiring masks, or whether they should be saved for healthcare professionals. It wasn't until early April, which in the grand scheme of things is quite late in the spread of this condition, before masks really started to be actively pushed in the United States. So if we want to think about what countries, if you will, did it right, I think we see that it's the ones that already had norms of mask wearing that fared the best. And so that is primarily going to be East Asian countries who have dealt with these sorts of outbreaks before and have figured out effective ways to deal with them. And mask wearing turns out to be a very effective way of dealing with it. And there's differences, other cultural differences in play here as well, that Europeans and Americans aren't used to being told what to do by their government, aren't used to having things shut down and following public health orders and seeing the economy majorly shut down for a significant period of time. And perhaps in some countries, there was more open-mindedness to the value of making this move early on in order to prevent the spread.
So, based on how the U.S. did respond, talk about the world's perception. And this is kind of a loaded question, but the world's perception and how it may change moving forward.
It's really hard to say. I think we're going to have to wait and see. This pandemic comes in the midst of other transitions, political transitions in the United States that have been reshaping the world's perspective on us. And the world's perspective on us is constantly evolving based on various political considerations. I think that if the world remembers this event as most significantly affecting the United States and sees the United States as failing to prevent it from happening, then that could certainly lower some of people's perspectives in other countries in the United States. if they ultimately say, well, other countries like the United Kingdom and Italy were similarly affected, then perhaps they would look to a broader set of reasons why these tragic events took place the way they did, and not necessarily see it as a uniquely American issue. I definitely think that the United States is also going to be, or how people view the United States is also going to be shaped in part by how well the vaccines that we produce or invested in work, and how effectively widespread they are in preventing this, both in the United States as well as in the rest of the world. And we've seen some recent moves to try to increase distribution and production of vaccines. We've seen the government and the Biden administration take a more active role in trying to find ways to bring corporations who are normally competitors together in terms of producing more vaccines. And so ultimately, the United States may be remembered for doing what it often does best, which is to make the sort of technological achievements that change the shape of a particular history, even as some of the larger socio-political trends in the United States continue to lead to tragic outcomes for portions of the population.
You alluded to this earlier, but I do want to put up another graphic here. More deaths in the United States. And here on the graphic, we're going to see that these are deaths from wars, epidemics, attacks, and disasters. And again, you talked a little bit, or at least alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I do think it's important for viewers to carefully walk through this to get a sense of where COVID-19 is in all of this. I really do want to go to the 1918 flu and just ask the question of you, Andrew. So we look at COVID-19 at 500,000, and again, more statistics, I know. And then the flu back in 1918. That number isn't too different from where we are, and yet this country is so different. I mean, we're so much more advanced, and I think that's the question that people are asking. How does a country as advanced as ours, how are we able to put this graphic up and show this? So make sense of this for us, if you would.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a striking comparison, and it's meaningful. And I bring it up in my classes that we are moving towards this number, which is so shocking, of nearly 700,000 deaths. I think with the rollout of vaccines, we might not actually get there, but even sort of stripped of any historical considerations, it's a shocking comparison. It's worth noting that the United States' population is now 3 times what it was in 1918. And so to actually get to that outcome as a percentage of population, we would be talking closer to 2 million deaths as opposed to 500,000 or wherever we end up. And so ultimately, we have fared better than we did in 1918 if we're making that comparison. And the primary reason for that is probably going to be because of our ability to quickly and effectively produce a vaccine, which is going to prevent another peak of this disease next year. That the 1918 flu had an initial very large peak and then 2 smaller peaks in subsequent, or at least one pretty significant peak in subsequent the next year, 1919 and 1920, which accounted for some of the deaths as well. From a public health perspective, though, it's worth noting that a lot of our approaches now are similar to our approaches then, that wearing masks was used, that social distancing and shutting down large events was used, and we can actually see that that did make a difference. It's also worth noting that the portion of the population that is most at risk was somewhat different in 1918. That today it is primarily people over 65 and people with pre-existing conditions who have been affected, though there's a wider swath and an unpredictability. In 1918, people between the ages of 20 and 40 were also disproportionately affected by that flu. And so we had perhaps a larger swath of the population, and children as well, younger children. We had a larger swath of the population that perhaps was likely to have a severe or even fatal reaction to that disease.
Okay. So comparing, pandemic to pandemic. Now others are comparing the numbers to war. World
Right.
War I, World War II, Vietnam combined. We've heard that. And there are folks out there who would argue, hold on, you can't really compare. It's like apples and oranges. You can't compare the two because one is politically driven, right? The other biologically driven. However, for those of us who are looking at this and saying, but hold on, COVID-19 had political reaction, right? So there is some political, there's actually a lot of political put into it. So when people say to you, Andrew, is it really fair to compare COVID-19 to wars? How do you respond to that?
For the most part, I would resist that comparison. And there's a few reasons. I mean, first of all, it's worth pointing out that when we look at war deaths, a significant portion of those numbers, if we just look at them from the early part, well, let's say the whole 20th century, something like a third of those deaths are actually going to be from disease, as opposed to battlefield wounds. And so wars are drivers of infectious disease. And this was particularly the case in 1918 because World War I ended at the same moment that we were peaking in the 1918 flu. And so it's worth bearing in mind that when we look at war numbers, they actually reflect biological forces as well. I think we also need to keep in mind that especially when we look at U.S. war numbers, we're talking about wars which were not waged on U.S. soil, which didn't affect or kill U.S. civilians, and which the United States entered relatively late compared to other countries. So if we wanted to make the comparison to war, it would probably be more accurate to compare the deaths from a pandemic to war deaths in, say, France or Russia or Germany during World War I or World War II, in which we have the full brunt of the war affecting the full population for an extended period of time.
Okay, thank you. In the minutes we have remaining now, I want to throw another number out there. I read somewhere that for every one person who has died from COVID-19, you have about 9 family members impacted. So we can get away from statistics for a minute and talk about how real this is, right? So you have people who've passed away, and now we have people who remain who have to deal with this past year and what it brought to their particular family. Comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a particularly insidious aspect of diseases like this. And, you could go back to the Black Plague and other previous pandemics to see these effects that people were simply trying to care for their family and do the right thing and be there to support their loved ones. And it caused, these events in which so many people were affected by this disease. And it reflects and it causes some of these disproportionate impacts that I referred to earlier. That the fact is that when we look back 5 or 10 years from now on COVID-19, some of us are going to remember how it changed our life in various ways and made things more uncertain and unusual and affected our careers, among other things, but not really think about it in terms of the sickness and having the sickness and people who died. And others are going to have these tragic memories and experiences of one or more close family members or friends dying. And the truth is that we have a sort of pretty great diversity of experiences from this, that the meaning of COVID is going to be very different, and that is going to look different depending on what segment of the population that you look at. So people who were living in nursing homes during this time, people in already marginalized communities, which have been disproportionately affected, are going to have a different viewpoint on these effects. And certainly the fact that certain situations and certain communities tend to live in multi-generational households that perhaps are more densely populated, is going to lead to this disease affecting those families more than others.
Okay, thank you. We've got about a minute left, Andrew, and I ask this of so many of our guests. In about a minute, lesson learned in this for you.
You know, I've been teaching through this pandemic, and one thing that I've learned is that my students really benefit from diverse learning and engagement modalities, that having Zoom available as an option in the classroom can be really beneficial to help students who have different family and disability and other situations, work and responsibility situations, be part of the class in a way that they never were before. They would just be absent on a given day, or that they wouldn't be able to engage in quite the same way. And so I think it has demonstrated to many of us how new technologies can provide new accommodations to our students.
Andrew Hogan, I want to thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your time and expertise and your perspective. Thank you so much for that as we talk about 500,000. I want to thank our students who are working so hard behind the scenes as well. As we close, a look at scenes from the Jocelyn Sculpture Garden in Omaha, as seen through the lens of Maria Consbrook, a junior at UNO. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at netnebraska.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call UNO Television at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.